I really believe that the idea of capabilities is the idea of capabilities as something which stretches from humans to machines to systems to organizations to a lot of other things is a very important one which has been neglected. Peter and I are going to try and change the world by exposing this neglected idea. And everything which I say in this talk will presuppose that I'm using words in the exact way in which they're defined in basic formal ontology. And I'll try and explain those definitions, but the definitions are part of a collection of definitions which is now in logical and philosophical terms in very good shape. All right, what do IQ tests measure? The origins of this work on capabilities lie in a paper called Functions in Basic Formal Ontology, which was published in a journal called Applied Ontology, which is a journal read primarily by people working in computer science and other real disciplines. And this was a special issue of the journal which was devoted to the topic of functions. And I agreed to contribute a paper to this journal before I realized that the editors of the special issue wanted all of the papers in the journal to pay attention to the ideas on functions put forward in this paper by somebody called Mark Artiga. Now, under normal circumstances, of course, I wouldn't have cared about what Mark Artiga thinks about functions, but I was forced to care a little bit. But I didn't really see the importance. I think Mark Artiga has some really interesting things to say in this paper. But I only realized that weeks after writing my own paper, or the paper we wrote on functions. So I will. So this is the main idea which Artiga defends, that any account of function has to satisfy 4 desiderata. It has to do justice to what he calls teleology, which means that if a thing has a function, that means that the thing exists because something was needed to do that thing. So a heater has the function to heat. What that means is that somebody built this artifact in order to heat. So they didn't build it in order to look nice or in order to make a tinny noise when rain falls on it. They built it in order to heat. That's what functions are. They are the attributes that things have when they are built to exercise that attribute. Then there is normativity. So once you have it that this artifact or this system inside your body exists in order to do a certain thing, then you can measure how well it does it. So this is called normativity. And then the third criterion, he says, is that an entity's function is appropriately distinguished from its accidental side effects. So the side effects of the pumping of the blood by the heart are the thumping noises which are made by the heart, but they're just side effects. And any theory of function has to distinguish functionings from side effects. And then the fourth criterion he calls epiphenomenalism, which says that the function of an entity is determined by its current performance. This one is just wrong. Many entities have a function and never perform. They never realize their function. This is true of most sperm, for instance. So current performance is not relevant. What is relevant, this is normativity, which we saw. Just to see what normativity means, a heart, for instance, has the function to pump. When it's functioning well, we say it's functioning well, but then gradually it functions less well, and then you die. And we evaluate the functioning of the heart on a scale of functioning well, or not functioning well, or not functioning at all. All right, so the reason to reject epiphenomenalism I've already explained, but we can substitute a near equivalent, which I'm going to call realization. The function of an entity is not how it's currently performing, it's how it's disposed to perform, its potential to perform, or its tendency to perform. So functions are dispositions. That's what BFO says. Now, accident is actually redundant, because if we have teleology, then we know that there is a distinction between functionings, which are realizations of the entity's function, and accidental side effects. So we don't need that criterion. So we now have the simplified Artiga list. Teleology, normativity, realization. Normativity just says you can evaluate realizations as better or worse. Now, there are other entities which are realizable entities in addition to functions. So, roles, for instance, the role of being a student is realized by performing studenty activities. The role of being an employee is realized by signing employment contracts and by following the instructions of your supervisor and so on. These are realizable entities, but they're not dispositions. They fall under a different heading within BFO. The sorts of realizable entities we're interested in here are what we call internally grounded. What this means is that they are a matter of the physics of the bearer. And these we call dispositions. So, a disposition is a tendency or a potentiality or a power that an entity has because of the way it is physically. So I have the capacity to speak English because my brain is a certain way physically. And habits and skills and so on, these are all dispositions from the perspective that I'm defending here. This is a long list of human dispositions. So growing, learning, sweating, I'm not sure why shattering is there. Losing teeth, curtsying, maybe the last time that word is used on this planet. It's a dying art. It's probably illegal. So, now Artiga thinks that a function is a disposition. I mean, I'm just cleaning up Artiga a little bit, but this is what Artiga should think. Artiga thinks that a function is a disposition which plays an important role in explaining why an entity exists and which can be graded on a scale. That's what he thinks. Now, there are no functions here. It is not the function of any human being to curtsy or to mock or to die or to lose teeth. But there are items on this list which satisfy normativity. So normativity can be detached from function. So speaking can be graded on a scale. Some people can speak better than others. Arguing can be graded on a scale. Curtsying can be graded on a scale. Dancing can be graded on a scale, but they're not functions. So we can separate normativity from being a function to define capability. So these are all the dispositions. The capabilities are those dispositions which can be graded on a scale. And the functions, so the capability I'm just using as a synonym of the usual capacity, ability, competence, facility, and so on. Functions are capabilities which provide the reason for the existence of their bearer. So functions are special kinds of capabilities. Capabilities are special kinds of dispositions. Now this works not just for humans, but for all the other things that have capabilities. So these are machine dispositions. And now we have to shatter. So some machines have a disposition to shatter. Some machines have a disposition to weld or to bend or to heat and so on. These are all capabilities of machines. They're sometimes also functions. It's the function of a welding machine to weld. It's the function of a heating machine to heat. So some capabilities of machines are also functions of machines. No capabilities of an organism are also functions of the organism, because organisms don't have functions, but they do have capabilities. But every machine has both functions and capabilities, which Artiga would call side effects. For instance, your car has the capability to resist rust, to provide you with nice music, to keep you warm, and so on. But they're not the functions of the car, they are just capabilities which go along as side effects. All right. Now, so this is all of the items marked yes here can be graded on a scale relative to some norm, as Artiga puts it. The problem is that there are different sorts of norm. So you could grade rotting on a scale. So this particular kind of fruit rots really well. Or decaying, or banging your head against the wall. You can grade, even doing French philosophy, you can grade on a scale. So we'll assume for the moment that the norm here is just a statistical standard. Then some proponents of French philosophy are statistically more unintelligible than others, which is a good thing for French philosophy. So we're not interested. It's not a capability. To bang your head against the wall is not a capability, but you can grade it on a scale. Some people bang their head against the wall more quickly than others, for instance. So what we want is norms which are norms of benefit. Now we're moving outside the realm of formal ontology. We're moving into the ontology which has to do with the way human beings experience the world. So there are only capabilities, I believe, and this is even a kind of small concession to the Steve Kirshner kind of view, there are only capabilities in a world in which there are human beings, or entities which can assess benefit and enjoy benefit. So, and then the beneficiaries we saw in discussing Peter's talk are things like yourself or your family, or if in the case of a machine the beneficiary might be the owner or the manager, or and so on. Now there are many counterexamples to this idea, because there are many different ways in which people use the word capability, and so we're going to have to work very hard to work out how to define capability in a precise enough way. So first of all, we have to recognize that the scale we use, or the scales we use to grade people's dispositions, may be multidimensional. So one and the same disposition of a human being may be a capability when viewed in one respect, and a positive harm for the human being when or the realization may be a positive harm when viewed in another respect. And so we appreciate that it's not going to be a simple matter to identify a simple unique scale for each kind of capability. It's going to be more complicated than that. And Peter actually deals with some of those issues in his dissertation. So we're going to need to look at reference classes. So what is a capability for a 13-year-old boy may not be a capability for a 50-year-old adult male, for instance. So we need to think about benefit in terms of relevant reference classes, but then we also need the reference classes to be somehow normal or typical. So somebody who is really good at attempting suicide is not going to be part of a relevant reference class for determining how to understand human capabilities, even though we might say Johnny is capable of suicide. All right. So the norm has to be a norm of benefit, and the values on the scale are measures of benefit, and that means that it includes only positive values. So we are going to be dealing with disabilities at some stage where we would include negative values, but here we're interested in capabilities, so we have to imagine the scale beginning at roughly 0 and going upwards. It's probably going to flatten off. In fact, that would be an empirical hypothesis that I would embrace, that every capability obeys a law of diminishing returns. That however good you are at something, there will come a point where you will not be getting more benefit from being a little bit better. Another issue is that exercising capabilities can, if you exercise them too much rather than too well, then typically that brings disbenefits. But that's another dimension. I don't think that's a relevant counterexample. All right, now, and also we have to understand whether we mean just statistical norm when we talk about a norm, or whether we mean something more subtle than that. All right, so there are learned capabilities such as speaking, commanding, cooking, and then there are not learned capabilities such as digesting or actually I've got speaking on both lists because it's kind of on the border. So seeing is not learned. Speaking is something which is innate. We all have the innate capability to speak, but we exercise it only from a certain point in our development because we've been stimulated in certain ways by our mothers and so forth. So, we're going to use etiology to define function. All of these are dispositions. So, that slide doesn't fit here. All of these are dispositions, the not learned and the learned. Dispositions are continuants. So there are no functions here. As I said that before, human beings do not have functions. But the capabilities of both human beings and machines often flow from the functions of their parts. So the parts of human beings have functions. My capability to think is based upon the function of a certain part of my brain to think or to perform cognitive operations. My capability to digest food depends upon the function of my digestive system to digest food. Just as the capability of my car to brake, which is not the function of my car, depends upon the function of the braking system in my car. So in the brain there are parts which have functions. Now, this is where we come to the etiology. Whether a capability is a function depends upon why it exists. Whether a disposition is a capability depends on whether its realizations can be graded on a scale in the sense explained, namely a scale which measures benefit. Now, human intelligence it was defined by the American Psychological Association. So in a few years we won't be able to say this either. Along with curtsying, the word intelligence is going to become gradually less and less used. But while we still can. So individuals differ from one another in their ability to understand complex ideas and so on. And we know that human brain development begins at 16 days. And human brain development includes the development of a certain part of the brain, which may be very small, it is very small at the beginning, which serves as the bearer of dispositions to cognition, to those things which belong, the exercise of which belong to the realm of intelligence. So we call this the G part. We don't know exactly which part of the brain it is. It may be different from different people, although it will be overlapping. It will certainly grow and change over time, but it's the same G part, even though it's growing and changing. Just as it's the same heart, even though it's growing and changing over time. So human brain development starts with the sensory part, then the language part, and then the higher cognitive function. And by about the age of 14, you've developed the G part, more or less, to where it's going to be. So it's because the G part has the function of exercising intelligence, the capability called intelligence, that human beings have that capability. The G part has the function, therefore human beings have the capability. So what do IQ tests measure? So when we perform an IQ test on a subject, we're measuring the value on a common scale, which has been established by many people doing research, of those realizations of the function of the G part of S's brain. All our brains have a G part, which were triggered by the items on the test. So we grapple with the items on the test. Our brains grapple with the items on the test and produce outputs from the stimulus, which are the items on the test. Those outputs are then used to calculate one's position on the scale. Now, why should we believe that IQ exists? Because we have many independent measures. We have different sorts of tests, including tests which are which don't measure intelligence in the sense of measuring conscious grappling with puzzles, but which measure other things which are known to be highly correlated with measures measured by the typical intelligence tests. We also are beginning to understand the genes which are correlated with different values on the IQ scale. So this is a study, the results of which were published in May last year, with 80,000 subjects, a genome-wide association study which identified 52 genes which are tied in some way to human intelligence. And gradually, as they get more and more GWAS data from more and more subjects, they will work out all the genes which are tied to human intelligence. Now, one of the tests which is correlated with the typical adult IQ test is the Fagan test of infant intelligence, which measures the time instants spend looking at novel stimuli. And that the results of this test turn out to be, this is done on babies, turn out to be highly correlated with IQ tests done on teenagers and adults. So the IQ test is really just like the QSART test, a quantitative pseudometer autonomic reflex testing, which basically measures sweat production. You have sweat glands which have the function of producing sweat. Therefore, you have the capability of sweating, and we measure your capability of sweating along the scale called the QSART scale, which is a measure of the functioning of your sweat glands. And I think that's the end.